Okay, we're live. I tend to start off all of these videos in exactly the same way, so maybe we'll like spice it up a bit. So the title of the video today is Are Pastors Going Extinct? And that's a bit of a, I guess, spicy title for some people, but today we have a very special guest to talk about, I suppose, this climate that we're in at the moment, what the future of ministry looks like. Pastor Jesse Herford. Welcome, Jesse.
Oi, kia ora koutou katoa. So good to be with you guys. Thanks for the invitation.
No worries. We were thinking of people to ask to talk about this sort of topic, and you were one of the first to spring to mind because you're just in so many different places. You're always on social media. You know, everyone knows who you are. But for those who don't, do you want to just maybe introduce yourself, where you actually come from and your church?
That is very flattering, Mary Ellen. Thank you. I'll give you your $20 later. As you guys have said, my name's Jesse. I'm originally from South New South Wales Conference, from the beautiful little village of Robertson, home to the Big Potato. So shout out
Big Potato.
Well, man, you know,
is it a hamlet? Is it called a hamlet?
I don't. How do you define a hamlet? I don't.
Or a village?
There's about 2,000 people who live there. So
nice.
Is that? I don't know. It's a beautiful place. It's a very gentrified piece of the country. A lot of posh people now. I don't come from a very posh family though. My dad's a farmer, and yeah, I'm the eldest of four. I was homeschooled. When I say that to people, they either say, "Oh, well, that explains a lot," or they'll say, "I would never have known." So either way, but yeah, currently I'm a pastor living in Palmerston North, New Zealand, the most okayest city in New Zealand, and loving it. Yeah, that's
awesome.
in a nutshell.
Yeah. That was a comprehensive bio. Love it. I also love that people have very opposite reactions to being homeschooled. I think often homeschoolers get a lot of flack. So good job for handling that.
Yeah, I've met a lot of homeschool people in my time, so I know where the flack is coming from.
So I love the Kiwi intro that you gave us, Jesse, because it seems like you're finding yourself at home in New Zealand, and it's nice to see that you're embracing the culture there.
Well, I'm a big believer in going local. You know, I'm Aussie as it comes. You know, both my parents are Australian. I have no Kiwi ethnicity or any sort of cultural card that I can wave up in the air and go, "Hey, I'm one of you." But being in New Zealand, you know, I've found that one of the best ways to I guess not get people to like you, but to kind of fit into the culture and the swing of things is to embrace the culture. And, you know, I'm not an expert in Te Reo Māori, or, you know, I can't really say my mihi if you asked me, but I do want to embrace the culture as much as possible. And yeah, I don't know. It's just one of those wisdoms that you pick up from older pastors, you know, when they tell you about how to make it in ministry. So, yeah.
I love it how you
say. Nice.
Sorry, Jared, you go.
Keep going, Mary.
I was just going to say,
how long have you been ministering in New Zealand for? We're doing it all the time. Jinx.
Oh no, must be a lag, I think.
Yeah. I've been here just coming up for 5 years. Yeah. So I came to New Zealand straight out of Avondale. I went through Avondale 2012 to 2015. Got called straight out of Avondale to Tauranga, actually, or Tauranga, and did my internship there. And then for the last 3 years, I've been down here in Palmy. So yeah, it's been a wild ride.
Before you mentioned that you really like to embrace the culture, and obviously being a local church pastor, you know, you're on the front lines, you're in the thick of it. But as well as that, you also do burn the haystack, which is hopefully a term that everyone is familiar with, that you do a podcast. Shameless plug.
Yeah, shameless plug. It kind of has to come up, I suppose. Anyway, I'm not ashamed of Burn the Haystack. Let it be known. So a fellow pastor, Josh Stothers, and I co-host Burn the Haystack together. We've been doing it for a couple of years now. We're currently on break, so we have a break in the middle and the end of every year, but we're about to go back into it in 2 weeks' time, and we just talk about faith and culture. A great little podcast. Great guests like Mary Ellen Fairfax in our most recent episode. Man, what a cracker! Love it.
What an honor to be a part of it. I've always wanted to be a part of it. So thanks for asking me.
Stop. All right.
You say it's a podcast about, church and culture. And I love that. I think that's just so relevant in this globalized world that we live in. But a question I've always had, and I've never asked you this before, but being a pastor of a fairly, I think, small congregation, is that right?
Yeah, 50 people.
50 people, yeah. So these really big topics that you talk about, these are global issues sometimes for the church. How does what you talk about on the podcast influence or marry up with your experience as a local church pastor? Like, is it wildly different, or do you try and, go down the same route if you can?
I'm really lucky in that a lot of the stuff that happens in my everyday ministry actually can translate to the podcast. I know not every pastor has that privilege. So for context sake, my church is called Mosaic. We are we're a church plant. Well, I don't know if you can really call us a church plant. We're about 10 years old. So I don't know what point a church plant stops being a church plant. But we've still got that church plant vibe where you can kind of do what you want to do. And so I'm very lucky. I find a lot of podcasters, especially, we tend to whinge and complain about things that we feel are never going to be able to feasibly happen. Oh, wouldn't it be great if, we could all do whatever? But at Mosaic, I actually have been able to do some of the things that we talk about in the podcast. Recently, we had a really interesting discussion about race. We were kind of just coming off the George Floyd murder and the information that was coming through. And we actually had an opportunity in our local church to share some of that. And we haven't talked about that heaps on the podcast, but it's impossible not to talk about it. So church life, podcast ministry, they overlap all the time. So I'm very lucky. I recognize that is not the reality for a lot of church pastors, especially young church pastors. So I'm very thankful for that. Yeah.
Jesse, we've seen, particularly at the moment with the coronavirus restrictions and things like that, that I guess church has changed. Church, as I grew up with it, as I've always known it, has changed. That's not necessarily a bad thing, in times of crisis, in times of persecution, in times of difficulty, the church has always found ways to adapt and to flourish and to thrive, because as we've talked about a lot here on Record Live, the church is the people, not necessarily just the building, the institution. We recognize that, but it has challenged the sort of past few months of 2020 have really challenged the way church is traditionally done. And we wanted to unpack a little bit about that today, just to see what it's like for you on the ground as a minister at the grassroots, and what you see as some of the changes that have come through, which we've talked a little bit about with our friend Josh Wood as well and others, how coronavirus has impacted the church. We talked about that in the early months of coronavirus, but as we start to dream that we can come out of this thing, the ways that ministry might change coming out of it, and maybe talk a little bit to your experience in recent times, how it has already changed, because I know some people aren't allowed to do visitations anymore. It's not necessarily preaching in the same traditional way. Some of those things have changed and are still in place for many of our ministers around this division. What does it look like going forward? That's a big question, and we can unpack it in a number of different ways as we go through this conversation. But that's sort of what we wanted to cover and what we wanted to investigate today.
Yeah. So much. I mean, to say that things have changed significantly is the understatement of the century. The interesting thing that I found here in New Zealand, we're in a place that not a lot of other people in the rest of the world are in that we are now able to meet in our full I was going to say the full Monty, but that's inappropriate. Like the full expression of what it's like to have the conventional church. We're able to do that now. And I've seen a lot of churches go back to the way things were. But there are some churches that haven't. So I'll backtrack to what it was like for us, because here in New Zealand, we went into lockdown hard and fast before much of the world. I think it was like us in South Korea who were in lockdown, that early. And we, in our first week, we were just scratching our heads. What in the world are we going to do? And we decided before lockdown happened that we were going to close Mosaic because we felt it was the right thing to do. We felt it was the responsible thing to do. We went into lockdown on the Tuesday. So on the Sabbath, we decided that we would close church and we would do Facebook church. And so at that point, we were able to have a small amount of people in one space to do the church service. And we kind of assumed that was how it was going to be, which of course it didn't end up being that way, but at least at the beginning it was. And so we had church in my lounge room just over there, and there was 5 of us. My worship coordinator Rodu on the guitar, and his wife Julene preaching a message, and me sharing some prayer time. And it was like it was like a small group. It was like a Friday night Vespers with friends, and we were blown away because on Facebook we got, over the course of 2 hours, about 1,200 views of this one church live stream.
Wow.
And I shared, we are 50 people. Like, we're a small little church. And we were blown away. Now, will I say those numbers persisted or grew larger during the rest of lockdown? No, because then everybody started doing live stream. And Avondale College Church started doing live stream, and at that point, everybody was like, "Okay, we'll just go to Avondale. They're the best." No, but but no, it was a steep learning curve for everybody. I keep saying I'm grateful, but I am grateful because, like, I'm the youngest pastor in my conference. I'm 27, so I feel old, even though I know that's, some older people go, well, of course not. Well, no, I'm not. But as far as pastors are concerned, I'm the youngest person in our entire conference. And Stobbers, by the way, is the next youngest. And so for me, it came a lot easier than it did for a lot of my other colleagues. And we shifted from being the pastor who speaks up the front at church and does visitations to all of this stuff was having to go online. I made a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails, a lot of Facebook messages. The thing that really, I think, illustrated to me was that the core heart of what ministry is, that didn't change. Like, in terms of shepherding people, creating community, and we can go into some details if you like about what that actually looked like. And a lot of it is very similar to what other people did, but that didn't change. It's just the packaging had to change. And you know what? I think in some ways, we, during lockdown, fed some of our congregation better than we would any other time. Because during lockdown, we had an opportunity to still be very personal, reaching out to people via the phone or via a Zoom or via a FaceTime call or whatever, but still allowing them the space to be in their own space, in safety, in relative comfort, all that sort of thing. I really feel for our extroverts during lockdown. They were absolutely dying out there.
Yeah.
I felt really sorry for some of our older members. There's one gentleman in particular who's in a retirement, sort of low economic flat here in Palmy. He only has email. So my weekly bulletin newsletter was literally the only touch point that he has for the whole month. So that was really tough. But ironically, as a pastor, I felt less of a pastor during lockdown. I felt more like a YouTuber.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm guessing you guys kind of feel the same way, even to this moment.
I remember in an interview we did with you a little while ago, though, Jesse, you said that you wanted to be a YouTuber. So there you go. It just kind of fell into place.
You know what? It kind of wore off. The shine wore off after a few weeks, I will admit. I don't know, that sweet David Dobrik or whatever PewDiePie money just didn't come for me. I don't know why. So I don't know what happened, man.
Yeah. It's interesting how you mentioned, you felt like a YouTuber, and you said, I think when you first started talking, maybe it was a while ago, I'm not sure, but you said, everyone would tune into Avondale instead of tuning into Mosaic, or that kind of a vibe. How can small churches, like, what is the benefit of a small church? I think the statistics were done in America. They did a survey where only about, I think 30% of people that regularly went to church, don't quote me on the percentage, but it was something like that, are no longer tuning into their local church service. They'll tune into like Hillsong or Elevation or one of these really big preacher people. So what value does local church have now that we're in this different space?
Well, look, I think I could just state the plain obvious facts. So maybe we'll get over that really quickly. It's being in contact with people that you can actually see. Like, you can actually feasibly go, I can't see Susan right now, but I know that in a couple of weeks' time I will be able to. Or I know I can't see John physically, but I know that I can pick the phone up and I can talk to him. Whereas, look, I love Elevation and Hillsong as much as the next guy. I'm a millennial. I love the music. I love the whole vibe. I look very enviously on their stage setup and their lights and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But I know that I'm not a Stephen Furtick preacher. So, there is that. I do think that those churches are doing an amazing job. Transformation Church is one of the ones that really popped up and just went absolutely bananas in a good way during lockdown. They still are. And they're doing amazing things, but I don't think that there is any substitute for local. I don't think there's any substitute for actually being a part of something where that you could feasibly make contact with a real person and you could see them physically and they understand the local context and culture where you're at. I think at the very beginning, I kind of felt that pressure of I need to invest in all the gear. I need to buy like a huge aperture light and I have to get a Blackmagic 4K Pro Mini or something ridiculous, wouldn't it be sweet? It would be so sweet. But then I was like, I don't have $20,000 to spend, and my church would kill me if I asked for that budget. So, I'm a big advocate for just using what you have. I think any filmmaker will tell you that you don't need to buy all this huge gear to make something authentic and real. It's about the content. And look, at the end of the day, as amazing as Stephen Furtick is, there are going to be some people who are going to listen to a sermon of his and go, doesn't really do anything for me, and that is what it is. And they might listen to a sermon by one of you guys or by me and go, for some reason, I connect with that. And, that I think there's value in that.
I was going to be the devil's advocate just then. Sorry, Jared. I'll let you speak in a second. And say, then what's the point in small churches even doing anything when they're, competing with Stephen Furtick, to bring him up again. But I guess you just said it. It's about letting the Holy Spirit work and not, assuming that you have nothing to give just because everyone's in the digital space.
Yeah. I think it's a consumeristic mindset. As much as I kind of cringe to say that, because it's kind of like everybody talks about big churches in terms of, it's so consumeristic. You can just go and, sit in the audience or sit on a live stream and whatever. But you know what, when I look at the Acts model church, and not that we should all be striving to fit ourselves within a certain very specific parameter, but churches in the first century were not big. And they weren't something that you went to. They were something that you were part of. And I kind of when I first started at Mosaic, I wanted to kind of grow it into a big elevation. I was like, oh, we're so small right now, but if we just did this and this and this, maybe we could become like a big church one day.
Mhm.
And that's kind of worn off a little bit. I'm kind of like, well, actually, small's okay. Small's good. There's a place for us. Let's get over Jesse's ego. All right, sweet, let's do that.
Biggest challenge.
yeah, pastor, hard. Oh,
it's interesting you say some of that, Jesse, because like we're seeing a trend at the moment. Like Instagram was big, a few years back, and it was airbrushed, it was perfect, you had the gear to get the photos. The people that did best on Instagram have the most polished, most beautiful, most designed feeds, right?
Mm.
But now we see the surge of things like TikTok, which is quite raw. It's just rough. It's someone's phone camera, and it's very easy to tell that it's someone's phone camera.
Mm.
More and more churches at the moment are doing Zoom church, and some churches are filming the whole hog and doing a polished production, but many others are just doing this sort of thing, having a conversation with some of their church members, and it's quite low budget. It's quite easy. Everyone can do it. It's very accessible. And so I just wanted to make that observation with what you're saying. It's not all about, I guess, the gear at this time, but looking at that in terms of the perspective of the minister's role, because if anyone can have a conversation like a small group, if churches are moving more towards house groups or we're worshiping at home, if we want inspiration, we'll watch someone famous. If we want a big sermon, we'll get an inspirational video on YouTube. But I want to just hang out with my friends and my buddies. Does that challenge the traditional role, at least in the Adventist church, in my lifetime, what the role of a minister is? Because I've seen a minister they're supposed to be a good preacher. Bonus points if they do visitations, because everyone complains if they don't. But a lot of times people complain, oh, we don't know what the minister does. They're not visiting us, or maybe they're doing Bible studies every night with different people and the youth, and they're out there, winning souls. It seems like the minister's supposed to do everything but nothing, but it's a bit unclear as to what that is. And yet in the current context with small groups moving back to that house church model or moving on to online churches, what is the minister's role? And is it because we've got it wrong and we're readjusting, or is it somewhere in between?
The churches that are going back to the way things were, I think, are doing that because they are moving, or the ministers that are running those churches are wanting to move their congregations back to the way things were when it was a clergy-led scenario. As much as they might protest that accusation, as it were, I think that's pretty much what's going on there. I have found during this, and this has been quite a humbling experience. Actually, my whole experience with Mosaic has been humbling because of how unique this church is. Let it not be said that I'm, bemoaning or anything like that. It's been great. But I think that the role of the clergy must change if we are going to have clergy in the future at all. I'm the youngest pastor in my conference.
Interesting.
Well, yeah, okay. I'll back this up. I am the youngest pastor in my conference, and in the 5 years that I've been here, and I'm only using North New Zealand Conference as a sample size, the new pastors that we've had come into the conference have been over 30. One of them between the ages of 30 and 40 that I'm aware of. The rest of them over their 40s. Now, I'm not putting down mature age pastors, those who come into the ministry later, or those who are transferring from different parts of the world or the different parts of the country. That's fine. But what I am seeing is a lack of desire and a lack of motivation for young pastors to come through. Now, young pastors are coming through. I know my peers that were coming through when I was graduating, and so on and so forth. They do exist, but many of them are not lasting. And there are, at least here in New Zealand, no young men or women that I have come into contact with who turn 18 and say, I'm going to Avondale, I'm going to be a pastor. That just hasn't happened. Now, why is that happening? I don't know. As I said, there are still pastors going through seminaries, and they're still young pastors, young out of high school students or in their 20s students. They're still happening, but I'm noticing a slowing down rate. Of my class, only about a third of them graduated. When I talk to my mentor, Wayne Krause, there's only like 2 or 3 of his peers, and he's in his 50s now, maybe even 60s. I don't even know. He's an old fella. Anyway.
If you're watching, Wayne, sorry about that.
Too old.
Great mentor. But, you know, we're wearing out our pastors, and I'm seeing more and more now. So many different reasons why that is, okay? And from my perspective, where I'm sitting in ministry right now, there is a sense in which what is expected of me is not compatible with what is needed in the culture that I'm living in. I'll give you an example. When we started Burn the Haystack, it was because in my internship program, I needed to do an evangelistic campaign to fulfill that part of my requirement. Both Stothers and I said to each other, Daniel and Revelation, it has its place, but it's not really our thing, and we're not passionate about it. And we know we could do it. I grew up on this stuff. I know all this stuff. I had the Bible studies from a very early age, but I know that if I did it, I'd just be phoning it in, and I don't want to do that. So we said, hey, to our conference, and our conference is great, by the way. I'm not denigrating I have the most incredible church leadership here. They've been so supportive. We said to them, hey, can we do something digital online? And they said, sure, go for it. So we started making these silly YouTube videos, and eventually out of it, we started a podcast. And the podcast, for some reason, stuck, and we're still doing it to this day. So I'm not saying that everybody has to start a podcast. I'm not saying that's true of everybody. But what I am saying is that what is expected of pastors, whether it's spoken or unspoken, is unsustainable, because, simply put, most people aren't going to show up every night for 5 nights a week for 6 weeks or whatever to hear about the 144,000 and the mark of the beast. It's just not going to happen. And so when it comes to COVID, a lot of the stuff, the podcast just kept going. If I was running an in-person evangelistic crusade, all of that would have been shut down instantly. That whole thing would have been dead in the water. Burn the Haystack, it kept going, man. It actually was zero, unaffected. In no way was Burn the Haystack hampered or affected by what we were doing. Yeah,
that's a really powerful statement. We have a question here from Brendan Wotherspoon. He says, have you ever felt that COVID is a medium or a first step to suppressing religious freedom through limiting face-to-face contact or hearing a preacher's message? Interesting perspective.
I suppose the question is asking, was the virus created by somebody in a lab somewhere to all part of some elaborate plan? I think at that point you're starting to get into conspiratorial, unless there's concrete evidence that can come out to prove that. I would say that any way going down that road, that's dangerous territory, my friend. Yeah.
You mentioned before, just sort of like, the fact that Burn the Haystack still was around. There was no limit to that during COVID and all that kind of stuff. I do see a handful of pastors, and obviously I don't know all of the pastors in the South Pacific Division. So I would say it's a minority, maybe it's not, but there are certain pastors that are on Instagram, on TikTok, have podcasts, and, you know, people know them. And there's kind of like this side hustle going on. Is there, just out of personal curiosity, you know, in your role as a pastor, is having that kind of a side hustle something that the institution looks favorably upon? Is it a conflict of interest? You know, how do you manage your time even?
This is something I wondered about as well, because, as you said, there are a lot of pastors, like Josh has a TikTok account and he does TikToks, and I'm just going to put it out there. I don't get TikTok. This is part of, I feel old. I don't get TikTok. I've tried, but there's something about it. I flip through a few TikToks and I go, cool, closing that up. I don't know.
The thing is, you have to spend hours and hours like investing in it in order to understand. So yeah, I completely understand.
Yeah. No, I'm not invested enough to actually help the algorithm help me. So I think there's two things here. The first thing is a side hustle that's ministry based, in which case you're probably not going to get paid for it, or at least you're not going to get paid much. And if you get paid something, so Burn the Haystack, we do sponsorships. In fact, season 4 is going to be sponsored by Avondale. I don't even know if we've announced that. So yeah, anyway, Laura can.
You heard it here first.
Breaking news.
Breaking news.
So there is money coming in for that, but that's not going into my pocket. That's going into the ministry. And, you know, we have to be accountable to my local church who holds that account. And so I can't just spend money, whatever. So there's one thing. So there's ministry. Okay. And then the other side is something which I've wondered about, which is what if I wanted to start a Twitch channel, or making YouTube videos about board games, or whatever interests that you might have. If you started to gain views on something like that, you could monetize it. And then it could be potentially seen as a side hustle in the real sense, because it's actually generating revenue. Now, there is a little line in the contract that every pastor has to sign, which says, I will not be stacking shelves at Woolies on my off time to have a side job. Obviously, that part of the contract was written way before any of this came into being. So I have no doubt that there are pastors out there who might have a YouTube channel. They might have enabled AdSense. They might be getting sponsorship deals. I don't know them. If they are there, please contact me so that you can. No, but I think it could potentially be an issue for pastors down the track, because if you are putting time and effort into, you know, I have a camera, you know, sitting here for live streaming and all that sort of stuff. And it's not the greatest thing, but I could use it to make YouTube videos. And if I enabled AdSense, I could potentially make money from it. It would be maybe like 20 cents, but it would be money. Yeah. So to answer your question, I think it might become a problem a little bit later on. Once more of our generation starts actually getting into side hustles, whether it's podcasting and actually getting proper money from it, or YouTube, or TikTok, or whatever the case may be. So I think it's a really interesting thing that's going to have to develop over time. But I'm still a little bit undecided on how I think it's going to go.
Jesse, we had a comment on our promotional post for this episode from Anna, and she says that she makes a statement, and I'll read you the statement that she makes, and then we'll get your, I guess, reflections or your perspective on that. Has COVID really changed traditional ministry roles' main focus, which should be about building a discipleship movement, building up the body? But maybe COVID has exposed us. It's not all about the performance, not about the show, not about the pretense of religiosity, but maybe this is a call back to the heart of what the church is. I want to get your thoughts on that statement, because, you know, as a pastor, I guess you could take that two ways. You could be sort of offended that people think that pastoral ministry is propping up the show, I guess. you might be challenged or motivated by that, or you may agree or disagree. Yeah, what are your thoughts on Anna's comments there?
Okay, so if I may, I'll tackle it from the perspective of pastor and also from the perspective of a church member.
Yeah, great.
So from the perspective of a pastor, yes. If you were to just look at the Bible, as we love to do, when we have a question about something, we always say, what does the Bible say? And I have issues with that question, but if we were to do that and say, what is a pastor supposed to do? What's in his or her job description? According to the Bible, the only job description we have is found in Ephesians, really, and that's to equip and build up the saints for the work of ministry. That's my job. And so everything that I do should be graded against that metric. Now, of course, we have created so many other metrics to evaluate performance and all that sort of thing. But at the very heart of it, that is what I'm supposed to do. And so, as I mentioned before, the heart of ministry hasn't changed. That will never change. I think even if we were to experience a zombie apocalypse or some sort of nuclear apocalypse where all the internet networks get knocked out and we were, just subsisting on Twinkies or, whatever it is that they eat in these zombie movies. I'm thinking of Zombieland. The heart of ministry can't change. My job is to equip people to do ministry. And the reality is, most of the time, we're not doing that. We're just, I don't want to say putting on a show, but sometimes it feels like that. And sometimes it feels like we are not actually achieving anything meaningful apart from telling each other everything's okay. We're part of this really great club. Isn't it nice that we're all part of this really great club? And isn't it a shame that other people aren't a part of this really great club as well? That's pretty brutal, but that's, I think, the brutal reality that many of us feel in ministry, if we are actually being honest. But most of us probably wouldn't say that because they're a lot more tactful than I am.
Well, you're brave to say it, that's for sure. Yeah, it's important to make that known. And I think, well, actually, my question is, is that an issue with the training of pastors, with the church institutional structure? Is it an issue with, attitudes and sort of expectations? Where does the rubber hit the road when it comes to this, and how can we change that?
Yeah, look, I really wish that, not knocking Avondale, but I wish that when I was at Avondale, for instance, I received a leadership class, or how do you manage people? How do you deal with people who are just out to get you, or who are toxic, or how do you manage really delicate relational dynamics? How do you be tactful? Look, this is stuff that most people only learn from experience, and that's fine. Some of these things you can't teach in a class, but I do wish that I had a class or two on leadership. But the institution ultimately creates the educational institutions that train people to uphold the institution. So it's not Avondale's fault necessarily. I think it is our overall structure, but we've also been given a structure by Christianity at large. So it's not like the Seventh-day Adventists in 1863 decided to create something completely new without any influence from their Methodist or Baptist heritage. They drew upon all of it when creating the church. So we have about 300 or 400 years of Protestant tradition to lean on, which is then leaning on another about 2,000 years of Catholic or Orthodox tradition. So we've created this thing which looks almost completely different from what Jesus had in mind. Or not that I can say what Jesus had in mind, but certainly what the picture in the first century, according to the historical text that we have, looks like.
Right.
Now, who's to say that Jesus didn't actually have that in mind when he gave the commission to his disciples in Matthew 28? Maybe he did. Who knows? We've done with this thing what we've done with it, And here we are 2,000 years later, having to deal with this thing. But what I will say is that in some sense, we have excuses. So maybe it sounds like I've made a whole bunch of excuses, but in another sense, we don't have any excuses because we have the biblical text and we have 2,000 years of interpretation to lean on to say, well, what is it actually speaking to us, and how do we actually interpret that for our modern context? And I think that, this is something that a lot of people have caught on in the last, I don't know how many years, in my lifetime. We've realized, discipleship is the core of it. If I'm not actually building into people's lives, then what's it all for? If I'm not helping people transform into the Christ image that is in them, the Psalm 8 sort of, you have made us a little lower than the angels. You have crowned them with glory and honor. That image of discipleship, of finding out who we are in Christ. If we're not doing that, then what's it all for? I was recently listening to a podcast interviewing Matthew Gamble, who used to be a hotshot pastor, came to Australia all the time, is no longer a pastor. And he said that in all of his years as being a pastor, he didn't get that. He preached about it. He talked about it a lot, about that transformation, about changing his ways, about, becoming that new creation. Just never happened for him. And it made me have to stop and think and go, am I being transformed? And am I allowing God to use this broken vessel to initiate and to complete transformation in other people? A lot of soul searching in that question.
In a nutshell, Jesse, give us a breakdown, if you can. What's one thing that you've learned in this COVID-19 stuff in your ministry that you'd like to take out of this? What does it look like after? The most important thing that you've picked up, or that's changed for you because of this experience of this year, 2020.
Just one thing. The method doesn't matter. That's probably it. I mean, obviously it does kind of, but if you have the heart, as I said before, the heart of ministry, if you got that straight in your head and your heart, the method doesn't matter. My church right now is talking about doing messy Sabbaths where we don't have a sermon and we don't have a worship set. We're talking about lockdown Sabbaths where we actually initiate a self-imposed lockdown on ourselves.
I love that.
And great. We just tell our members, you're locked down this Sabbath. Don't come to church. Spend time with your whānau. Spend time with the people that matter. Do what you got to do. Have a dinner party. Go for a walk. Lie in bed all day. So I think that's one thing I've learned. The method does not matter. As long as the heart is engaged, allow yourself to be as creative as possible. And I know that I'm coming from a place of privilege because I actually can be very creative in my position. I know that not everybody can do that. But I think that the future of the church depends on us being able to shift and morph according to what the needs in our community are. And if we can figure out some ways to engage people better, I don't really care if the church is empty on a Sabbath morning. If the people of God are doing ministry, then praise the Lord. That's heaps good. That's so good.
It sounds to me almost as though we should all just become church plants rather than actual churches, because it seems like there's a lot more freedom.
Man, when people, it's a curse and a blessing. People kind of look down on church plants because they're not a real church, but then you can do whatever you want within reason. But it's great.
Sounds a little bit like your church, Garrett. Are you at a church plant or are you at an actual church?
Look, we're in an actual church, Mary Ellen. Wow.
Oh, Freudian slip right there.
The church. What is the church? This is what we've been talking about all day. I feel like we're on Have You Been Paying Attention? We're in the same boat as Jesse. We've probably been around sort of 8 to 10 years now. So we are a church plant, but there comes a point where you have to maybe stop calling yourself a church plant. I don't know where that point is, but we have some of the similar freedoms and informality that Jesse's talking about. So yeah, we're fairly new established church. We are an organized company, I think, but not a church, an organized church yet. And I don't know about your church, Jesse, but I don't think we have any plans to get a building and become an organized church anytime soon, because as you say, there's just too many restrictions and difficulties that come with that, and too much financial burden, and it just doesn't seem to work in the modern expensive world that we find ourselves in. So yeah, at this point in time, we're just happy being an old church plant, an aged ancient church plant.
It's ironic. Our church has actually been looking for a building to rent for, because we're doing the hireage situation.
Yep.
The pack up, set down every Sabbath sort of deal. But yeah, we've been looking to rent for about a year now, and we have been tragically unsuccessful every step of the way. We get really, really close to something, and then something happens and it falls apart. And it's happened like 3 times to us now. So maybe God's telling us that this is not his plan. I don't know. But yeah, I hear you.
Perhaps one final question from me, at least. Jesse, Mary Ellen might have something else, but we are running out of time today. I'm just thinking, what would the ideal pastor look like for you, pastoral role, and also ministry, I guess, in that a lot of people that are watching this broadcast may not be pastors, so we want to leave them with something to go away with as well. But for you, what would ideal a pastor be doing to help us as members, and perhaps what they should be doing in ministry as well? If you could give them a take-home point, like what is it that in an ideal world, we understand we don't live in that, but something that you'd like to see the church be going forward?
This may sound like career suicide, but I am a huge advocate. I'm a huge fan of bivocational ministry, of the pastor not being a full-time pastor. So my ideal would be the pastor is a community leader, maybe a small business owner, involved in some charitable trust or something like that. I think that a pastor should be somebody involved and invested in their local space. If I was talking about me, my ideal would be like a restaurant owner or something like that. And then not to take away time from real ministry, but I just think that being invested and ingrained, rooted deeply in your local community is so important, because most pastors are itinerant. They move to a city or a town, they're there for a couple of years and they just move on. It's you don't feel like you're part of anywhere. You don't feel like you've ever made a home. As somebody who moved around a lot as a kid, I don't have, like, I say I'm from Robertson, but the reality is I've spent about 5 years of my life in Robertson. Every other part of my life I was living in Western Australia or South Australia, or not South Australia, Victoria, or wherever. So I think being deeply rooted. And then the second thing is just being probably more along the lines of a life coach or a trainer or a coach, somebody like that. How do you grow in your walk with Jesus? The pastor is the person that helps you with that. How do I get over my addictions to whatever? The pastor is the person you talk to about that. It's not, in my mind, it's not a unicorn sort of highly skilled, very, very focused role. It's a role that is all about being that hero maker. To use the book as an example, that was such a huge influence on my ministry. Being a hero maker to people, and helping the church grow. Look, if somebody has a theological question, yes, sure, I've got theological training. You can ask me about Daniel 8:14, or you can ask me about what is exegesis and all that sort of stuff. But really at its core, that stuff doesn't help me that much in my day-to-day ministry. Yeah, so I guess a ingrained in the community business leader or community member, and somebody who trains, that's my ideal.
And that's, I guess, attainable to all of us as church members, because, I see my role at the local church as being someone who needs to also reach others for Jesus. And, I have a job that's not pastoral ministry. I'm a magazine editor, but at the same time, it feels like my lifestyle should be a ministry as well, like the way I live as a Seventh-day Adventist, and the role that I have in my community and my family and my neighborhood. So what your answer is encapsulated really is all of that sort of ingrained, embedded, incarnational. I like that word. It's an incarnational ministry that, Jesus sort of demonstrated. So it's quite different to a traditional Seventh-day Adventist way of doing things. I guess because we were quite small, we moved our pastors a lot, and we've just continued to do that. We shift our pastors, and there's politics involved when the church sort of gets tired of a pastor. They want a new one. But there are guys in the New Testament who moved a lot. Paul and some of them were on missionary journeys, but they're more evangelists, aren't they? More evangelist role than a pastoral role, which the elders are sort of fulfilling. So yeah, perhaps we need to rethink what pastoral ministry really looks like.
We've had an overwhelming amount of positive comments from people really agreeing with your perspective, Jesse. So thank you for sharing. Pastors really need to be ministering to their own. Take her message at least right now. But yeah, for everyone who's tuned in, thank you so much. But maybe Jesse, you want to have a look through later, some of them, or
definitely
live if you have time.
Yep.
But yeah, next week we'll be back with another record live. And look, Jesse, it's just my prayer that some of these challenging and inspiring thoughts and things that you've shared will actually get put into practice. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, you guys. This has been an awesome chat.
Thanks, Jesse. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. See you guys next week.